January 1888, Wyoming Territory. The cold came down from the mountains like something with a purpose. Not the ordinary cold of a hard winter, not the kind that bit at your ears and made your breath cloud white in the morning air. This was different. This was the kind of cold that got inside walls, that found the gap between a window frame and its sill, the crack where the door didn't quite sit, flush of the space between two logs where the chinking had shrunk and pulled away. It found these places the way water finds low ground, patiently, inevitably, with all the time in the world. Inside one of the cabins in the Laramie Valley, a child had stopped crying. Not because she was warm, because she was too cold to cry. She was 3 years old, and her lips had gone a color that lips are not supposed to go, and the adults around her were doing everything adults do when they have run out of options and will not admit it. Adding wood to a fire that couldn't keep up, wrapping blankets around a small body that kept losing whatever warmth the blankets gave. Moving with the particular frantic efficiency of people who understand somewhere below the level of conscious thought that what they are doing is not enough. The thermometer on the wall read 34 degrees Fahrenheit inside the cabin. That was January of 1888. But to understand what happened that January, you have to go back to November of 1887, to a ridge above the valley, to a woman named Nora Callahan, 64 years old, standing alone in the cold, with a hammer in her hand and a row of planks that the neighbors were already calling the most foolish thing they had seen built in Laramie County in 20 years. She had started on a Tuesday morning, which was not a significant choice. Nora did not assign significance to days of the week. She had been a practical woman her entire life, and practical women start things when the materials are ready and the weather allows, not when the calendar provides a satisfying date. The materials had been ready since September. She had spent August and September salvaging lumber pulling planks from a collapsed outbuilding at the back of her property, sorting them by length and condition, setting aside the ones that were sound and using the others for firewood. She had ordered tar paper from the general store in town, 2 full rolls of it, which had caused Silas Pruitt behind the counter to look at her with a particular expression he reserved for purchases he found interesting enough to repeat to others. She had ordered iron nails in 3 sizes. She had sharpened her tools. She had drawn a plan on the back of a flour sack, measurements marked in her careful small hand. And then she had waited for November, because in November was when the work made sense, when the air was cold enough that you understood in your bones why you were building what you were building. On that Tuesday morning, she laid out her materials on the ground in front of her cabin's single door and looked at what she had. Enough for a box, not a large box. 5 feet deep, just wide enough to encompass the doorframe. It would not look like anything a person had ever intended to build. It would look like a mistake or a whim or the product of a mind that had lost its usual discipline. She knew this before she drove the first nail. She built it anyway. Crofton Biggs came by on the 3rd day. He was a big man, broad through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of face that Wyoming weather had worked on for 30 years and left looking like something carved rather than grown. He had the homestead 2 miles to the east, one of the established properties in the valley, and he rode past Nora's place regularly on his way to and from town. He had a habit of stopping when he saw something worth commenting on. He stopped now. He sat on his horse at the edge of her property and looked at what she was building. Looked at it for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he is deciding how to classify. Then he said, "Building yourself a palace, Nora, or just gone soft in the head." He said it with a grin that was practiced, the grin of a man who had spent a lifetime being the person who said the thing everyone was thinking. Nora did not look up from her work. She had a plank against the frame checking the fit, and she held it there with one hand while she assessed the alignment. The plank fit correctly. She reached for a nail. Crofton waited for a response that did not come. His grin held for a moment and then began to lose its certainty. He shifted in the saddle. He said, "Might as well nail it shut. Save yourself the trouble when the real snow flies." Still nothing. He chuckled a sound with no one to receive it and spurred his horse toward town. Nora drove the nail home. By the end of that week, Silas Pruitt had told everyone who came into the general store about the tar paper and the nails and had added to this factual account his own theory about what Nora was building and why, which was not a theory founded on any particular knowledge, but which had the confident shape of one. "She's adding a whole room just for the front door," he told people. "A room you have to walk through to get into the house. Doesn't make a lick of sense. Woman's been alone out there too long. This was the version of events that traveled through the valley over the following week, gathering details and losing accuracy as it went, until by the time it reached the far homesteads, it had become the story of the widow Callahan, who was building a second cabin attached to the first one for reasons no one could explain. Nora heard some version of this when she came to town for supplies at the end of November. She heard it in the particular silence that fell when she came through the door of the general store, and in the way Silas's manner shifted, becoming slightly too helpful, slightly too careful with his words. She bought her flour and her salt and her lamp oil, and she drove back up the ridge. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table after supper and looked at the wall across from her, which was the interior face of the wall that faced north, the wall that the wind hit first and hardest in January, and she thought about what she was building and why. She thought about the tar paper which she had layered over the interior walls of the vestibule, overlapping each course, tacking it flat, running her hand along each seam to ensure it lay smooth. She thought about the floor she had built 6 inches above the ground on cedar posts with a gap of air beneath it. She thought about those two doors, the original cabin door, solid oak, which would now become the inner door, and the new outer door she had constructed from 2 layers of salvaged pine with packed sawdust between them and a skin of tar paper over the whole assembly. She thought about still air. This was the thing that people did not understand, that Crofton Biggs with his grin and Silas Pruitt with his theories did not understand, that her grandmother had understood and had tried to explain to a young girl in the language that old women use with children, not the language of physics, which her grandmother had not known, but the language of direct experience of. Here is what I have learned by living here is what the cold does. Here is what stops it. Still air does not conduct heat. Moving air does. When you open a door to the outside, the warm air of the interior and the cold air of the exterior do not simply mix gradually at the threshold. They exchange violently. The warm air being lighter rises and rushes out. The cold air being heavier floods in along the floor. In the time it takes a person to step through a doorway, a significant portion of the heat that the fire has been building for hours is simply gone, given to the Wyoming winter, which accepts it without gratitude and without limit. A second door with a sealed chamber between them changes this entirely. You open the outer door and step into the chamber. The cold air that enters the chamber with you is a small volume, 5 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet roughly. That cold air does not reach the interior of the cabin because the inner door is closed. You close the outer door. The cold air is trapped. It begins almost immediately to warm because the inner door and the inner walls of the chamber are radiating heat from the cabin's interior, and the sealed space does not allow that warmth to escape. When you open the inner door, the air that enters the cabin is not outside air. It is the slightly warmed air of the chamber, a small and manageable volume, nothing like the continuous exchange that a single door allows. The cold does not stop. You simply stop giving it a direct path. Nora had understood this since she was a girl. She had lived in it in the house her grandmother had built in the old way with a small antechamber that in that country they called a cold trap, a phrase that meant exactly what it said. She had not thought about it in years. She had built her Wyoming cabin the way everyone built their Wyoming cabins, with a single door and a good fire and enough wood stacked to outlast the winter. She had lived in that cabin for 31 years with Declan, and the fire had been enough. Mostly because Declan was there to tend it, and because 2 people make more heat than one, and because they had been, for most of those years, young enough and strong enough that the cold was an inconvenience rather than an adversary. And then Declan was gone, and the winter had become something different. She thought about that now. January of 1887, the worst of it. She did not like to think about it. She had trained herself over the months since to move quickly past the images when they surface, the way you move quickly past a place where something has happened that you do not want to see again. But she let herself think about it, now deliberately, because she was building something that required her to understand exactly what she was building against. Declan had gotten sick in December. A cold first, the ordinary winter cold that everyone got, that moved through the lungs and the sinuses, and eventually burned itself out and left you tired, but recovered. But this one had not burned itself out. It had settled. It had gone deeper. By the first week of January, he was running a fever that the cold in the cabin was making worse, and by the second week, Dr. Vane had ridden out from town 3 times, and Nora had understood from the third visit, from the way the doctor's face arranged itself when he thought she wasn't watching what the arithmetic was going to come out to. The neighbors had come. Of course they had. This was the kind of community where people came when someone was sick, where they brought food and sat for an hour and said the things people say. And Nora had been grateful for this in the way you are grateful for things that cannot help, but that means something anyway. But she had noticed something. Every time the door opened, the doctor arriving, a neighbor leaving, someone going out to bring in more wood, every time that single door swung open to the January air outside, there was a moment, a breath. The fire shuddered. The warmth that had been building in the room for hours drew back like something frightened, and the cold poured in along the floor, and it took the fire a long time to recover what it had lost. She had counted 7 times the door opened on the day Declan died. She had not counted intentionally. She had been sitting beside his bed, holding his hand, doing the only thing she could still do, and some part of her mind that was not occupied with grief had simply kept the number 7. Each time the warmth in the room diminished, each time she watched his breathing and did the calculation that she could not stop herself from doing, the calculation that had no kindness in it, but that her practical mind performed regardless about cold and fever and the relationship between them. She did not know and would never know whether a vestibule would have made a difference. She was not the kind of woman who tormented herself with questions that had no answers. But she knew what she knew about cold and air and doors, and she knew that the cabin she had lived in for 31 years had one door, and that door had opened 7 times on the day Declan Callahan died. She was building the second door now. Prentice came around on a Saturday. He was 13 years old, the son of the family whose property abutted hers on the south side, and he had the particular quality of curiosity that some children have, the kind that is not impolite exactly, but that does not know how to stay at a distance from an interesting thing. He came to the edge of her property and stood there with his hands in his coat pockets and watched her work. She let him watch for a while. Then she said, "You have a question?" He did. He asked her what she was building. She told him. She explained it the way you explain things to someone who is actually listening, not simplified, not condescending, but complete. She told him about still air and moving air. She told him about the heat that a fire produced and the speed at which a door could give that heat away. She told him about the chamber between the 2 doors and what happened to the cold air that entered it. He listened with the focused attention of a child who has not yet learned to perform attention without actually paying it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, like a lock on a canal, "You close one gate before you open the other. Otherwise, the water just goes where it wants." Nora looked at him. She said exactly like that. "You're smarter than most men twice your age." He considered this with the solemnity it deserved, and then he went home and she went back to her work. Silas Pruitt came on the following Tuesday. He came with the specific energy of a man who has decided that his skepticism is a public service, who has appointed himself the representative of common sense in a situation that he believes common sense has abandoned. He tied his horse at the fence post and walked up to the unfinished vestibule and stood looking at it with his thumbs hooked in his belt. He said so, "This is Nora's folly in person." He said it with the lightness of a man who expects to be joined in the joke. Nora was fitting the outer door to its frame. The fit needed to be precise. Any gap would compromise the seal, and the seal was not decorative, it was functional. She continued fitting the door while Silas talked. He asked her what the tar paper was for, and she told him it was for insulation, that it trapped still air in the walls the same way the chamber trapped still air between the doors. He asked her if she honestly believed a little box was going to keep the cold out better than a good fire. She said it keeps the cold from getting in as fast as the fire is putting warmth out. That's the whole of it. He made the sound of a man who has heard something that he has already decided is wrong. Then he stepped forward and with the confidence of a man demonstrating a point took hold of the outer door handle and the inner door handle at the same time and opened both. The cold air came in, not as a dramatic rush, it was not that theatrical, but it came in the way cold air always comes in through an open door in November. Low along the floor, spreading across the boards, and the warmth of the room pulled back from it as warmth always does, and the fire in the hearth visible through the open inner door shuddered briefly. Nora turned and took the thermometer from the hook inside the doorway. She held it steady for 30 seconds. Then she looked at the reading and wrote it in the small notebook she kept on the shelf beside the door. Silas watched this, She said 53 degrees. That is what you read this morning before you opened the doors. She waited another 2 minutes while Silas stood there, no longer holding both doors open, but not quite comfortable either. She read the thermometer again. She said 45 degrees. She wrote it down. She said 8 degrees in 2 minutes through an opening that was open for perhaps 5 seconds. That is what happens every time someone opens a door. And in January, when it is 30 below outside instead of 20, the number is worse. She put the thermometer back on its hook. She said, "Thank you, Silas. You both helped me make my record complete." Silas stood in the doorway of a vestibule he had come to ridicule and looked at a woman who had just used his skepticism as a data point in a log she had apparently been keeping for weeks. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He said, "Well, reckon I've taken enough of your time." He walked back to his horse with the particular posture of a man who has left a conversation before he was ready to and rode toward town. Nora watched him go. Then she went back to fitting the outer door to its frame because the fit still needed to be precise, and Silas Pruitt being wrong was not a reason to do less careful work. By the end of November 1887, the vestibule was complete. It stood against the front of her cabin like something that did not quite belong, a small rectangular addition. Unadorned, its planking weathered already to match the gray of the cabin walls. Its two doors lined up one behind the other, so that stepping into it required a pause, a moment of being neither inside nor outside, a moment of being in the space between. She installed the thermometer on a hook at eye level just inside the outer door. She installed a second thermometer just inside the inner door where the cabin's air began. She installed a third on a post in the yard 15 feet from the structure where it would read the outdoor air without being influenced by the cabin's warmth. 3 readings, every morning, recorded in the notebook on the shelf. December 1st was the first day she took all 3 readings together and wrote them side by side in the notebook. Outdoor air, 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the vestibule, 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the cabin near the inner door, 51 degrees Fahrenheit. She looked at the numbers for a moment. Then she closed the notebook and put it on the shelf and went to make her breakfast. The numbers would accumulate. The winter was only beginning, and somewhere out there in the valley, the great freeze was building itself up, patient and vast and indifferent, preparing for January, the way all serious things prepare, without announcement, without warning, simply gathering until it was ready. Nora stoked the fire. She had wood enough. She had her 2 doors. She had her notebook. She was ready. December came in quietly. That was the thing about the worst winters in Wyoming territory. They did not announce themselves. They did not arrive with the theatrical violence of a storm you could see coming from 3 days away, a wall of black cloud rolling down from the mountains with lightning in it and the smell of rain turning to ice. The worst winters came in quietly like a patient creditor who has decided the time for politeness is over and is simply going to wait on your doorstep until you open the door. The temperature dropped through the first week of December, the way water drops through a crack in the ice steadily, incrementally each day, slightly colder than the last. Nothing so dramatic that you pointed at it and said, "Today is the day it changed." But the cumulative effect was undeniable. By the 10th of December, the ground had frozen to a depth that made digging impossible. By the 15th, the creek at the bottom of Nora's Ridge had locked from bank to bank. By the 20th, the air had acquired a quality she had learned to recognize over 31 Wyoming winters. A brittleness, a clarity so sharp, it almost had a sound as if the cold had refined the atmosphere down to something purer and more dangerous than ordinary air. She noticed these things the way she noticed everything attentively, practically without drama. Every morning she woke before light and put on her coat and her boots and walked to the thermometer outside the vestibule and read the number and walked back inside and read the number inside the vestibule and read the number just inside the cabin door. She wrote all 3 in the notebook on the shelf. She made her breakfast. She tended her fire. The numbers were telling her something that she already knew, but that was satisfying to see confirmed in ink. December 12th, outdoor temperature -6 Fahrenheit. Inside the vestibule after the outer door had been opened and closed once to take the reading 10 degrees Fahrenheit. 16 degrees warmer than outside. Not because the vestibule was heated, she burned no fire in it, had built no stove for it, but because the sealed air inside it warmed slightly by the heat radiating through the cabin's inner door and inner wall was protected from the wind and the exchange that the wind enforced. Still air held its temperature. Moving air surrendered it. Inside the cabin, near the inner door, 53 degrees Fahrenheit. She looked at the three numbers sitting side by side in the notebook column. -6, 10, 53. A staircase of warmth, each step earned by the sealed space, and the second door each degree, the product not of more wood burned, but of less heat lost. She had been burning approximately half the wood that she had burned in previous Decembers. Not because the winter was milder. It was not. She could look out her window and read the frost patterns on the glass and feel the air when she stepped outside and know that this December was harder than most. But the vestibule was doing what she had built it to do. Each time she moved between inside and outside, fetching wood from the stack against the cabin wall, checking on the chickens in their small, insulated coop, making the walk to the outhouse and back, the procedure was the same. Open the outer door, step in, close the outer door, a pause of 2 or 3 seconds in the dim cold of the chamber. Open the inner door, step inside, close the inner door. The cold never got a running start. That was the way she thought about it. A door opened directly to the outside gave the cold a running start into the warm interior. The vestibule stopped. It caught it in the chamber, held it there while the inner door stayed closed, and by the time the inner door opened, what entered the cabin was not the raw outside air, but the slightly tempered air of the chamber, a small and manageable intrusion rather than a direct assault. She wrote the numbers. She drank her coffee. Outside, the winter continued its quiet preparation. Crofton Biggs came by one evening in the second week of December, and he did not come to the door. She did not know this until afterward. She had been inside mending a piece of harness by lamplight when she heard something in the yard, a soft sound, the kind that could have been the wind shifting or an animal moving near the woodpile. She had not gone to check. She had learned in 2 years of living alone to distinguish between sounds that required investigation and sounds that did not, and this one had fallen into the latter category. In the morning, she saw the footprints. They came from the direction of the road, crossed the yard, and stopped at the outer door of the vestibule. She could read what had happened from the depression of the prints in the frozen ground, from the way they were positioned, from the length of time someone had apparently stood there. He had tried the outer door. The prints were close to it the way a person stands when they are reaching for a handle, and then he had stood just inside the vestibule for some time, long enough to leave a distinct impression where his weight had settled. Then the prints went back the way they had come. She stood in the yard in the early morning dark and looked at the prints and did not say anything because there was no one to say anything to. She thought about Crofton Biggs, who had a homestead 2 miles east and a horse he rode with a particular gait she could recognize from the track it left. She thought about a man who had come after dark alone without announcing himself to stand inside a structure he had publicly called foolish. She thought about what it would feel like to stand in that small, sealed space and notice the absence of wind, to put your hand against the interior wall and feel the warmth coming through from the fire on the other side, to stand in the dark in the quiet of it and understand, without anyone explaining it, what the difference was between here and outside. She went back inside and read her thermometers. -8, 9, 51. She wrote the numbers and put the notebook back on the shelf. Christmas came and went without ceremony. She was not a woman who required ceremony. She had been raised in a practical household and had spent her adult life building a practical life, and the rituals that mattered to her were the ones that served a function. The morning fire, the evening accounting of what had been done and what remained to be done, the weekly trip to town for what the homestead could not produce for itself. She attended the small Christmas service at the church in town because Declan had always attended and because certain habits outlast the reasons that created them. She sat in the pew they had always occupied, and she stood for the hymns, and she shook hands afterward with people she had known for 30 years, some of whom asked how she was getting on, and some of whom did not. And she drove back up the ridge in the early dark of a December afternoon with a small parcel of dried fruit the minister's wife had pressed into her hands. She noticed on the drive back that the sky to the north had a quality she did not like. It was not a storm sky. It was not the particular gray-purple of a blizzard building. It was clearer than that and colder looking. The kind of sky that meant not weather but temperature. That meant the air mass sitting up there was something different from what they had been dealing with in December, something of a different order entirely. She put the horse away and went inside and stoked the fire higher than usual before she went to bed. January 2nd. She woke at 4 in the morning and she knew before she lit the lamp that something had changed. The cabin was cold in a way it had not been. Not dramatically cold, not dangerous, but noticeably colder than recent mornings, the fire having burned down to coals overnight, and the interior temperature having dropped further than usual while it did. She got the fire going, and then she went to her thermometers. She read the outdoor thermometer through the outer door opening and closing it in the practiced 2-second sequence she now performed without thinking about it. She came back inside and looked at what she had written. Outdoor -19 Fahrenheit, vestibule -4 Fahrenheit, cabin interior 47 Fahrenheit. She stood at the kitchen table with the open notebook and looked at the outdoor number for a long moment. -19 was not a temperature she had seen in December. In the years she had been keeping records, she had started a simple temperature log, in her second winter alone, a habit born of the need to have something practical to focus on. -19 was a January temperature, a deep winter temperature, the kind that arrived at the bottom of a cold snap and usually stayed only a few days before moderating. But the sky last night had not looked like a temperature that was building to a peak and preparing to moderate. It had looked like a temperature that was preparing to go further. The Great Freeze arrived on January 7th. It did not announce itself with wind. That came later. It arrived first as stillness, an absolute comprehensive stillness, the kind the valley produced only when the temperature dropped far enough that even the air seemed to freeze into immobility. The creek, which had been locked since November, stopped making the faint sounds that locked creeks make the deep structural groaning of ice under its own tension. The trees stopped creaking. The horses in their stalls stopped moving with their usual restlessness and stood pressed together without sound. Nora read her thermometers at 5 in the morning on January 7th. Outdoor -22 Fahrenheit. Vestibule -7 Fahrenheit. Cabin interior 50 degrees Fahrenheit. She added wood to the fire and sat with her coffee and did the arithmetic of the winter in her head. She had wood enough. She had been burning at roughly half her usual rate since December, which meant her supply was in better condition than any previous January in her memory. The vestibule was performing at the upper end of what she had calculated it could do. The question was how long the temperature would hold at this level and whether it would go lower. It went lower. By January 9th, the outdoor reading was -25 Fahrenheit. She had not seen -25 in 31 years of Wyoming winters. She had seen stories about it, old-timers at the general store in town, men who had been in the territory since before it was a territory who had accounts of winters that made everything since seem mild. She had listened to these accounts the way you listen to accounts of weather that happened before you arrived, with respect, but without the full understanding that comes only from having been inside it. She was inside it now. Inside it in the specific sense, the literal sense, the sense that mattered. Her cabin held 51 degrees while outside the temperature sat at a number that could kill a man who stopped moving for 20 minutes. The vestibule held -8. Between the outer door and the inner door, between the Wyoming winter and Nora Callahan's kitchen, 15 degrees of temperature shifted across 5 feet of sealed air and 2 layers of insulated pine and tar paper. It was enough. It was more than enough. She knew without any particular satisfaction, but with a quiet and absolute certainty, that the structure she had built was doing precisely what she had built it to do. What she did not know yet, what no one in the valley knew yet, because the roads had been impassable since January 8th, and news did not travel when horses could not move through 3-foot drifts, was what was happening in the other cabins. She would learn this later. On the morning of January 10th, she heard something she had not expected to hear. A sound from outside, moving through the stillness that the cold had imposed on everything, a sound of effort, of something large and heavy working through deep snow, the rhythmic compression of drifts under weight. She went to the inner door and opened it, and then opened the outer door a crack, not wide, not in a way that would compromise the chamber, just enough to look, and she saw them. 2 figures on the road below the ridge, moving slowly, moving with the particular deliberateness of people who are conserving warmth with every step, who have calculated that they have a certain amount of heat in their bodies and they must make it last a certain distance, and they are doing the math with their legs. She watched until they were past. She did not know who they were. She closed the outer door and stood in the vestibule for a moment before opening the inner one. She went to her stove and put on a larger pot of water than she usually kept hot. The wind came on January 11th. It came from the north in the afternoon, not the screaming gale of a blizzard, but something more deliberate, a sustained push of Arctic air that had crossed 1,000 miles of open country and arrived with everything it had accumulated along the way. It hit the cabin, and the cabin held the 3-foot chinked log walls, doing what log walls do, absorbing the force and the cold and giving back warmth. But she could hear in the particular way that a person who has lived alone long enough learns to hear what the wind was doing to the valley below. A single-door cabin in that wind was a different proposition entirely from what she was experiencing. Each gust would force the cold through every gap and crack, and when a door opened, even briefly, even for the few seconds it took to step inside or outside, the wind would enforce an exchange of air that no amount of wood could fully compensate for. The fire would burn and the coal would come in, and the wood would diminish, and the family inside would make the calculation, consciously or not, about whether they had enough to last. Most of them did not have enough. She knew this in the abstract. She would learn it in the specific later. On the night of January 12th, the third day of the Great Freeze, Nora was sitting by her fire with her mending when she heard the outer door of the vestibule open. She set down the mending and waited. The outer door closed. Then after the interval, she had practiced herself into making automatic the interval during which the cold air settled in the chamber and did not rush through to the interior. The inner door opened. Crofton Biggs came into her cabin. He was a large man, and he had always carried himself with the particular physical confidence of large men who have spent their lives doing outdoor work, the confidence of someone who has tested his body against the territory and found himself adequate. That confidence was gone. What was in its place was something older and simpler. He was carrying his granddaughter. She was 3 years old, and Nora could see from across the room what color her lips had gone. Behind Crofton came his wife Vera, moving with the stiff, careful gait of a person who has been very cold for a long time and is not yet sure the cold is over. Crofton looked at Nora. He did not speak. She had not moved from her chair, but she was already assessing the child's color, her stillness, the rate of the visible rise and fall of her small chest. Nora said, "Bring her to the fire." He brought her. Nora rose and took the blanket from the back of her chair and wrapped it around the child, and then sat on the hearth beside Crofton and held the warmth in round the small body. She did not speak. There was nothing useful to say. She fed wood to the fire, careful and steady the way she did everything. Vera Biggs sat in the chair Nora had vacated and put her face in her hands. After a few minutes, the child moved, not dramatically. A small movement, the unconscious shifting of a body that has found warmth and is responding to it without yet knowing it is responding. Then a sound, low and uncertain, the sound of someone returning from a great distance. Then she began to cry. The sound of it in the warm cabin was extraordinary. Not because it was loud, it was thin and tired, the cry of a child who has used up most of her reserves, but because of what it meant. Crofton Biggs looked down at his granddaughter, and his face did something that Nora looked away from, because some things are private even when there are witnesses. Vera lowered her hands. She looked at the child. She looked at the fire. She looked at the walls of the cabin, which were 51 degrees and holding which had been 51 degrees for days, while the world outside went to -25. She said, "How?" Nora said, "2 doors, a sealed space between them. Still air doesn't conduct the cold the way moving air does." Vera looked at the vestibule. She looked at the outer door and the inner door lined up behind each other and the sealed, insulated space between them. She had passed through it without fully understanding what she was passing through, too focused on the child and the distance remaining. She said, "That's all it is." Nora said, "That's all it is." They stayed the night. There was no question of going back. Nora made room the way a practical woman makes room efficiently, without drama, without any performance of inconvenience or generosity. She had a spare blanket. She had food enough. She had a fire that her wood supply could sustain. These were the facts of the situation, and she responded to them. Crofton sat by the fire with his granddaughter across his lap, and he did not say much. He was not a man who found words easily even in ordinary circumstances, and these were not ordinary circumstances. He sat and let the warmth work on him, and occasionally looked at the vestibule, at the 2 doors, at the small sealed space that had changed the temperature of the air that reached his cabin by 15 degrees. At some point in the night, when Vera and the child were asleep and the fire had settled into its steady, maintained burn, he said, "I stood in there, in November." Nora was reading by lamplight. She looked up. He said, "At night, when you were out, I wanted to understand what you'd built." She waited. He said it was warmer. Even then, just standing in there with both doors closed. I could feel the difference. She said yes. He said I didn't say anything. She said I know. He was quiet for a while. Then he said I should have. She did not answer this because it was true and there was nothing to add to something that was true. Outside, the Great Freeze held the valley in its full grip. The temperature had not risen since January 7th. There was no indication it intended to. But inside the cabin on the ridge, the fire burned and the walls held, and the vestibule stood between the Wyoming winter and everything inside doing its small, sealed, sufficient work. Nora turned the page of her book. She would take the thermometer readings in the morning. She already knew what they would say. The Great Freeze broke on January 15th, not with drama, not with the theatrical collapse of a storm that has exhausted itself against the landscape. It broke the way it had arrived quietly, incrementally, 1 degree at a time over the course of a morning, the outdoor thermometer climbing from -23 to -19 to -14 with the slow, indifferent patience of weather that does not care what it costs the people living inside it. Nora read the thermometer at 5 in the morning, and again at 8, and again at noon, and she wrote the numbers in her notebook and looked at them and understood that the worst had passed. She did not feel relief in any simple sense. Relief was for people who had been uncertain about the outcome. She had not been uncertain. She had been cold and careful and attentive, and she had watched the numbers hold through 8 days of a freeze that the valley would talk about for the rest of the century, and the numbers had held because she had built something that was designed to make them hold. And now the freeze was releasing its grip, and the numbers were moving in the correct direction. And this was satisfying in the way that any well-built thing performing its function is satisfying, not triumphantly, not vindictively, but with a quiet completeness. Crofton Biggs and his wife and granddaughter had gone back to their own homestead 2 days earlier when the temperature had risen enough that the road was passable and the child was recovered sufficiently to travel. Crofton had stood at the inner door on his way out and looked at Nora for a moment. He had said, "I'll be back." She had understood this to mean something specific, not a social call, not the ordinary traffic of neighbors in a territory where neighbors were few and far between. Something else. She said, "I'll be here." He came back on January 17th. He came alone this time without his wife or the child riding his horse through the slowly moderating cold of a mid-January morning that felt almost mild after what had preceded it. He tied the horse at the fence post and came through the vestibule, opening the outer door, closing it, opening the inner door, closing it with the deliberate sequence of a man who was paying attention to what he was doing now in a way he had not paid attention before. He sat at her kitchen table. He said, "Tell me how you built it, every step." She looked at him across the table, at the face that Wyoming weather had been working on for 30 years, at the hands large and capable that rested on the table with the patience of hands that know how to work. She got up and took the flour sack from the shelf where she kept her plans. She unfolded it on the table between them. The measurements were marked in her small, careful hand, the dimensions of each element written clearly, the construction sequence annotated in the margins. She said, "Start with the frame. You want it 5 feet deep. No less. The depth is what gives the air time to settle before the inner door opens." He looked at the plan. He said, "Cedar posts for the floor." She said, 6 inches above ground. You need the air gap beneath, and you need to keep the snow from building up under the floorboards and conducting the cold upward. He nodded. He was the kind of man who nodded when he understood something and did not speak until he had a question. She walked him through it. The frame, the floor, the walls, the tar paper, every seam overlapped, every edge tacked flat, no gaps, no shortcuts. The outer door constructed from 2 layers of pine with packed sawdust between them and a skin of tar paper over the whole assembly. The inner door, which was simply the cabin's original door, repositioned now as the second barrier rather than the first. She told him the rule. She said, "You never open both doors at once. Never, not for convenience, not when your hands are full, not when the cold doesn't seem that bad. One door completely closed before the other opens. That's the whole discipline of it. The structure only works if the rule holds." He said, "Who enforces the rule when you're not there?" She said, "Everyone who lives in the house. It becomes a habit. You do it enough times and you stop thinking about it. You just do it the way you do anything you've learned to do correctly." He looked at the plan for a while longer. Then he rolled it up carefully, treating it with the respect you give to something that belongs to someone else and that you intend to return. She said, "Keep it. I know what it says." Silas Pruitt came 3 days later. He arrived differently than he had arrived in November. He did not tie his horse with the loose casual knot of a man making a brief social stop. He tied it with the tight knot of a man who expects to be there a while. He came through the vestibule without comment, performing the sequence correctly, without being told, which told her that someone had already explained it to him. He sat at the table. He had his hat in his hands, which was not a posture she associated with Silas Pruitt, who generally carried himself as though his hat were the least of his burdens. He said, "I heard tell your place stayed warm through the whole of it." She said it did. He said, "I heard the number. 50 degrees or near to it, the whole 8 days. She said the lowest it went was 47. That was the morning of the 9th. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Martha Hennessy's youngest. You heard about that." She had heard. The trapper who had made his way across the drifts on the 12th had brought news. The Hennessy child, 2 years old, had developed a cough in the first days of the freeze that had worsened with every opening of the cabin's single door, and by the 10th day the child was in a state that the family could not manage with what they had. The child had survived, but the margin had been close enough that the word survived carried weight when people used it. Nora said, "I heard." Silas said, and the Dunmore place lost their water pipes inside the walls. Temperature inside dropped to 28 before they got it up again. The Fletchers had ice forming on the interior walls. Us. Inside the cabin. She said nothing. These were not numbers that required commentary. He said, "I was wrong about your box." He said it plainly, without preamble, without the softening language that men who are not accustomed to being wrong sometimes use to make the admission less direct. He said it as a statement of fact. She said yes. He said, "I'd be obliged if you'd show me how to build one." She got the flour sack down from the shelf again. The news moved through the valley the way news moved in a place where distance between households was measured in miles and the nearest town was a half-day's ride. It moved through the trappers who could get across the drifts when others couldn't. It moved through the conversations at the general store as the roads became passable. It moved through the church on the first Sunday people could get to it, which was the last Sunday of January, and then it moved faster because church was where the valley gathered, and the valley had not gathered for 3 weeks and had a great deal to say. What people said was this: Nora Callahan's cabin held 50 degrees through the whole of it, half the wood, 2 doors. These 3 facts moved through the valley like a seed moving through water, finding every place where the soil was ready. The soil was ready everywhere. People had just come through 8 days that had cost them wood. They couldn't replace comfort. They couldn't recover health. They couldn't fully account for yet. They had come through it with the intimate, exhausting knowledge of exactly what their cabins could and could not do against a cold of that severity, and what most of their cabins could not do was considerable. They came to Nora, not all at once. They came the way people in the territory came to things one at a time, or in pairs, with the self-sufficient directness of men and women who had built their lives by doing what needed to be done without excessive deliberation. They tied their horses, they came through the vestibule, they sat at the table. Old Mr. Ganahy came, his hands gnarled with the arthritis that Wyoming winters had been working at for 40 years, and he sat across from her and asked her to explain it to him as simply as she could. She told him still air does not lose heat the way moving air does. 2 doors with a sealed space between them means the cold air never enters the cabin directly. It enters the space between the doors, it is contained there, and by the time the inner door opens, it is already warmer than outside air by a significant measure. He said in the tar paper, she said the tar paper seals the walls of the space so no cold air creeps through the gaps. Same principle. You are keeping the air still wherever you can. He said, "Sounds simple enough." She said, "It is simple. That's the whole of it." He left with her measurements written on a piece of paper in her hand, and she watched him ride toward his homestead and thought about his cabin, which she had been inside twice in 30 years, which had the thin walls of a structure built by a man alone who needed shelter fast and had not had time or material for anything more. She thought about what his winters had been inside those walls. She thought about what they would be now. The sound of construction began to move through the valley in February. Not loudly. The distances were too great for sound to carry from one homestead to the next. But if you were traveling the road that ran through the valley floor, If you were moving past the homesteads in the particular quiet of a cold February morning, you would hear it, the tap of a hammer, the rasp of a saw, the sound of someone working at a structure coming from places where in previous Februaries there had been no such sounds, because previous Februaries had been the deep of winter when no one built anything. Nora heard it as she traveled to town for her weekly supply run, and she heard it as she returned, and she heard it from her ridge on still mornings when the air was cold and clear enough to carry sound further than usual. She said nothing about it. It was not a thing that required comment. What she did do was make herself available. If someone came to her door, she was there. If someone came with a question about construction, she answered it. If someone came with a measurement she had given them and wanted it confirmed, she confirmed it. She did not go to people. She had never been the kind of woman who went to people with things they had not asked for, but she kept the fire going and the door of both doors available. It was on a Tuesday in late February that Dr. Edmund Vane came. He arrived in the late afternoon, which was not his usual time. He was a man of regular habits, and his habits put him in his office in the mornings and on his rounds in the early afternoon, and anything that took him out in the late afternoon was either an emergency or a deliberate departure from routine. This was the latter. He came through the vestibule correctly one door at a time, and he stood for a moment just inside the inner door, as he always stood just inside the inner door of her cabin, taking the temperature with his face the way doctors take temperatures professionally, attentively, as though the information might be diagnostically useful. Then he sat at the table and opened the bag he had brought with him. Inside the bag was a notebook, not his medical notebook, which she had seen on his previous visits, but a different one, newer with a cloth cover. He said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "Go ahead." He said, "The notebook you've been keeping, the temperature records." She went to the shelf and brought it to the table and set it in front of him. He opened it. He turned the pages slowly, reading the columns, running his finger down the dates and the numbers. He read without speaking for several minutes. She sat across from him and waited. He said 52 days of records. She said from the 1st of December. He said 3 readings a day, outdoor vestibule, cabin interior. She said yes. He said the outdoor readings track with what the territory's been recording. The cabin readings are, he paused, looking at the numbers. These are consistent. There's almost no variation in the interior reading, independent of the outdoor temperature. Your cabin interior held within 4 degrees of 50 throughout the entire freeze. She said the wood supply is what kept the interior stable. The vestibule is what made that possible. Without it, I'd have been burning twice the wood to achieve 10 degrees less. He looked up at her. He said, "I want to make a copy of this." She said, "Take it. I know what it says." He shook his head. He said, "I want to make a copy, not take the original. The original should stay with you." He paused. "I'm going to include this in my report to the county health office." She said, "What report?" He said, "I've been preparing a report on the effects of the Great Freeze on the health of the valley's residents. Respiratory illness, frostbite, the conditions I treated, during and after." He looked at the notebook again. "What you've documented here is the first systematic evidence I've seen of the thermal difference between a standard cabin and a vestibule-equipped structure under extreme conditions. I want it in the record." She looked at him. She said, "It's just numbers." He said, "It's exactly numbers. That's what makes it worth including." He closed the notebook and set it carefully on the table between them. "Nora, I've practiced medicine in this territory for 11 years. I can tell you from those 11 years that the winter respiratory cases, I see the coughs that turn to pneumonia, the frostbite that becomes amputation, the cold-related deaths in children and elderly, the majority of them trace back directly to drafts, to cold air entering warm spaces faster than the body can compensate. What you've built eliminates that, not partially, essentially completely as far as I can measure it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My husband died of a fever in January." He said, "I know. I was there." She said, "The door opened 7 times the day he died. I counted. I have thought about those 7 times every day since." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I know that too, and I don't know what would have been different. Medicine doesn't always offer that certainty." She said, "No. But I know what I was going to do about it regardless." He looked at her across the table with the expression of a man who has been practicing medicine long enough that he has developed a genuine respect for the forms of knowledge that are not his. He copied the notebook, every entry in his own careful hand. He was there until after dark. She lit an extra lamp and made coffee, and they sat on opposite sides of the table while he wrote, and she mended, and the fire held the cabin at 52 degrees. And outside, the February night settled over the valley at -4, and the vestibule did what it had been built to do. The town meeting in early March was the largest anyone in Millhaven Township could remember. It was not a large town. Large town meetings happened when everyone came, and everyone came this time, because the subject of the meeting was one that everyone had a direct and personal stake in, because the Great Freeze had made it so. Nora sat near the back of the room, which was the schoolhouse pressed in shoulder to shoulder with the rest of the valley, the air inside thick with the warmth of many bodies in a small space. Crofton Biggs stood at the front. He had not been asked to speak. No one had organized the meeting with Crofton Biggs in a speaking role. He simply stood up at the point in the proceedings when the discussion of the winter's losses had run through its full accounting, the pipes, the livestock, the wood supplies, the illnesses, and the room had gone quiet with the weight of it. He stood and he looked at the room. He was a big man, and he took up his full space, and he did not make himself smaller. He said, "I owe this room a plain statement." The room was quiet. He said, "I called Nora Callahan's vestibule foolish." I said it out loud, and I said it to more than one person, and I did not keep it quiet. I said she was soft in the head for building it. He paused. I was wrong about every word of that. What she built kept my granddaughter alive through the coldest night this valley has seen in 30 years, and I was too proud and too certain to learn from a woman who knew more than I did. He looked toward the back of the room where Nora was sitting. He said, "I've already started building mine. I'd encourage every person in this room to do the same before next October." He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't. Nora did not speak at the meeting. She had not planned to speak, and she did not speak. What she did was answer questions afterwards, standing in the cold outside the schoolhouse, while people gathered around her with the particular focused attention of people who have moved past skepticism into urgency. She answered every question. How deep? 5 feet, no less. Or what lumber? Whatever you have that's sound. The quality of construction matters more than the quality of material. Does it need to face a particular direction? Face it away from your prevailing wind if you can. But the principle works regardless. The tar paper. Where do you get it? The general store. Silas Pruitt carries it. She heard from somewhere in the group a sound that might have been Silas Pruitt clearing his throat. The rule. What's the rule? One door completely closed before the other opens. No exceptions. She said this twice clearly, with the emphasis of someone who understands that a principle is only as good as the discipline that maintains it. Teach it to everyone in the house. Make it as automatic as closing the gate to keep the livestock in. It is not complicated, but it must be consistent. They listened. They asked their questions. They wrote measurements on whatever they had to write on scraps of paper, the backs of envelopes, the flat of a palm. She answered until there were no more questions, and then she put on her coat and climbed into her wagon and drove back up the ridge in the cold March evening. The report that Dr. Edmund Vane filed with the Laramie County Health Office in April of 1888 was 7 pages long. It documented the health conditions of the valley's residents during and after the Great Freeze of January 1888. It documented the cases of frostbite and respiratory illness and cold-related deaths and near deaths. It documented the conditions in specific cabins, not by name in most cases, but by construction type and exposure. And it included as an appendix a complete copy of Nora Callahan's temperature notebook. 52 days of 3-point daily readings from December 1st through January 21st. With a note in Dr. Vane's hand that read these records were kept by Nora Callahan, homesteader, Laramie County, Wyoming Territory. Mrs. Callahan constructed a vestibule, a sealed antechamber with 2 independent doors at the entrance to her cabin in November 1887. The temperature records demonstrate that her cabin interior maintained a stable temperature of approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the Great Freeze, while consuming approximately half the firewood of comparable structures without vestibule construction. 0 cases of cold-related illness or injury were recorded in her household during the period in question. The note concluded, "The cold trap, as it has come to be called, locally represents a practical and readily constructible solution to the primary thermal vulnerability of single-door cabin construction in extreme cold conditions. Its widespread adoption is recommended." Nora did not know about this note for some months. When Dr. Vane told her about it in the summer, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Declan's name isn't in the report. He said no. But the reason you built it is. She thought about this. She said that's enough. The summer of 1888 was loud with construction. Through June and July and August, in the long evenings after the day's main work was done, the sound of hammers and saws moved across the valley with the steady persistence of people who had made a decision and were implementing it. Vestibules went up against the fronts of cabins that had stood with a single door for a decade or 2 decades or longer. Some were built with the precision of Nora's original. Every seam sealed the floor raised on cedar posts, the outer door properly insulated. Some were rougher logs instead of planks, mud chinking instead of tar paper, the principles honored in spirit, if not in every material detail. She went where she was asked. When Crofton Biggs wanted her to look at his construction and tell him if the fit of the outer door was sufficient, she rode over and looked at it and told him the top left corner needed another course of tar paper to close the gap. When old Mr. Ganahe's arthritis made it impossible for him to do the fine work of fitting the inner door to its frame, she spent a Saturday morning at his place and fitted it herself. When the family who had arrived in the valley in spring, knowing nothing of the winter just passed, asked at the general store whether they needed some kind of extra room before their front door, and were told by Silas Pruitt in a tone of complete authority exactly how to build one, and why she heard about this secondhand, and found it in the particular way that practical things find their own satisfying completeness sufficient. The winter of 1888 to 1889 was hard but not extraordinary. The temperatures dropped into the deep negatives in January, as they did most years, and the winds came down from the north with their usual force, and the valley moved through the cold months with the particular discipline of a community that has learned something important and has not forgotten it. The vestibules, most of them new and tight and properly constructed, performed as designed. Dr. Vane, keeping his records as he always did, noted in January of 1889 that his cold weather respiratory cases were down compared to the previous year, and that the cases of extreme frostbite were fewer, and that the calls he made to homesteads in the coldest weeks were less urgent generally than he was accustomed to. He wrote this in his notebook and also later in a letter to the Territorial Health Office. He attributed it directly to the vestibules. He attributed it by name to Nora Callahan. She was 65 that winter, and she had not slowed in any way that mattered to her. She cut her own wood. She tended her own animals. She made her weekly trip to town in all but the worst weather. She kept her notebook because the habit of keeping it had become one of those habits that does not require a reason to continue, that has become part of the daily structure of a life and would leave a gap if removed. She added a notation to the first page of the notebook in November of 1888 that she had not written there before. She wrote it in her small, careful hand, the same hand that had written 52 days of temperature readings the previous winter. She wrote Declan Callahan, January 1887. 7 times the door opened. Below that she wrote, "This is what the notebook is for." She closed the notebook and put it on the shelf and went to tend the fire. Outside, the Wyoming winter was beginning its preparations. The temperature was dropping. The creek was beginning to slow. The sky to the north had the clear, cold quality that meant the season was in earnest. Inside the cabin on the ridge, the fire burned at its careful, measured pace. The walls held the warmth. The 2 doors stood between the interior and the exterior, one behind the other, with the sealed space between them. The outer door did not move. The inner door did not move. The vestibule performed its quiet, structural, patient work, meaning the work it had been built to perform, the work it would go on performing through every winter that followed, asking nothing, requiring nothing but the simple discipline of one door at a time. Nora sat by the fire with her mending and her coffee and the notebook on the shelf and the thermometers on their hooks, and the knowledge, which she did not share because it did not require sharing, that what she had built was built correctly and would hold. It would hold for a long time. Long after the hands that built it had finished their work, and the woman who had counted 7 door openings on a January night in 1887 had no more winters to prepare for, the vestibule would stand against the cabin's front door, and travelers through the valley would see it and recognize it, and the people who lived in the valley would explain it with the ease of people explaining something that has always been true, something that does not require justification, because the justification is in the structure itself, visible and solid and sufficient. Close one door before you open the other. Keep the cold where it belongs. Build the thing you know how to build, regardless of who is watching. That was all of it. That was the whole of what Nora Callahan had done.